Hey folks, in this series of videos we're going to return to the ideas of object-oriented programming. Now right now that might sound a little bit weird because up until this point we've been working with C as a procedural or imperative language. What does that mean? It means we've been working just in terms of functions. We've written functions and these functions call other functions and they call more functions and so on and so forth. We haven't seen objects for the very simple reason that C isn't an object-oriented language. And so, well, what are we doing here then? We're going to actually try and implement objects in C. That is the goal of this series of videos. Now, as a step towards that, what we're going to first do in this video is review some basic object-oriented concepts. As we move forward, we'll see how those can map into different concepts in C, and then eventually we'll actually build a object/class/ADT in C for a stack. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is basically return to the idea of objects. So this is something, right, you maybe we're not expecting, right, but objects are now back, right? So we're back to object land. So the idea, right, in an object-oriented language, right, so think about Java, think about C++ or C# or other stuff like that, is you have these constructs, right, these things you can build called objects. And objects have basically two pieces. They have state and behavior. In a language like Java, that means you have some variables inside and some methods inside, right? That would be very typical, right? Same thing with C++, right? Except we call them variables and functions. It's the same idea though, right? I basically want to say that I have like places to store data and then a bunch of different behavior that I can call upon if I want, right? That's the basic idea of an object, right? Is I have these two things bundled together. And then when I have, these behaviors, the idea is that I can maybe use that behavior, right, and it'll look up or it can change that state that's associated with it, right? So there's kind of a bundling here of information, right, and behavior, right, or data and behavior. These two things are bundled together. And up until now, right, and think about C, we don't really have that idea, right? We kind of have standalone functions. We have maybe global variables as well, but it's as if there's only, one object or one piece of data in our system, right? So I can't kind of mimic objects right now because the idea is an object is, I have different objects, right? I have object A, object B, object C, object D, and so on and so forth. And each has their own individual state, each has their own individual behavior expressed over that state. But in something like C, it's like, well, the most I have is global variables. That's kind of like saying there's only one state out there. That's kind of like saying there's only one object out there, which, isn't really, an object, right? It doesn't really make any sense, right? So here, right, there's also the idea, right, of something that they call like a class. And typically we refer to a class as being something like a blueprint. It tells you basically how to construct an object. A class by itself isn't really a complete thing. Really what it is a list of behaviors and then some placeholders for your data. So it might say that, okay, I need to have this piece of information, this piece of information, and this piece of information. It'll kind of define this blueprint, right, for a object, but it won't be complete, right? And I need to fill in those things before I can actually construct an object, right? Before I can construct this thing that combines together data and behavior, and which I can then, right, do stuff within my system, right? So there's kind of two different ideas here, right? An object is something that's live in our system. It's something that I can actually work with, versus a class is more of a blueprint. Now, looking down at our picture for a second, we can kind of see this distinction. So on the top part, I have basically a class. And what this is this is a class for representing a rectangle that I might see on my screen in some programming language. Now we're not going to focus on which specific language. We're just saying that this is a class, period. The idea being here is I have maybe something that's meant to represent a rectangle, and I have different properties associated with it. So I have length, I have width, I have color. I have these different bits of state or bits of data, right, that should be associated with this class, right? So my class is maybe something like generic, and maybe has a name like rectangle, right? It's just a way to represent rectangles. But by itself, right, it's just a blueprint. It's like, well, rectangles could look like this, but it's not, complete. I don't know the length, I don't know the width, I don't know the color. I couldn't draw it on the screen if I wanted to, right? And that's where the idea of creating instances comes in. So an instance of a class is an object. Basically, the process of instantiation is to request an object from the system and fill in the blanks, right? So you're saying build me something new and fill in the length, the width, and the color. And from that we get actual real tangible things that we can actually use, right? So all of a sudden this rectangle has a definite length and width and color. This one over here, same thing, length, width, and color. All three of these, right, have basically look a little bit like rectangles, right? They all have this kind of shape, but then I filled in the blanks to make them more specific and more concrete. And so now I can actually have them in my system, right? So these are objects. So this is what we're kind of talking about, right? This notion of classes, notion of objects. What we eventually want to do is basically have a way to construct these objects, right? These things at the bottom of my screen in a language like C, right? So that's what we want to investigate, and that's where we'll start heading in the next video.